Hey, Steve, can you see me?
Yes, yeah. So I need to click on each person.
No, you don't. If you look at the chat, you've got like 12, 15 people in there that are going, yes, we hear you. Yes, we hear you.
Okay, that I wondered because I got no feedback. So is this one where there is a back and forth?
It can be if you want to invite people to join in and they can push the button at the top, or you can see, do you see to the right of your screen, the box that you're in, there's like a chat?
Yes.
Okay, they're answering you in there. So you can either do it with voice or you can have them ask questions in the chat, either way.
Okay, I need to find the chat, a way to get back to the chat because I'm only on a message at the moment. Here we go. Here we go. And now I see people beginning to answer. Okay, very good.
Okay, I'm going to jump out then.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay. If I can figure
Okay,
out.
thank you folks for bearing with me because I was sort of not knowing how this worked, whether it worked like one of those big Zoom calls or I guess I'm on and I'll keep an eye on the chats and you guys can let me know if you've got any questions. So the basic of this comes out of the fact that I think a lot of writers in a lot of genre writers over the years have worked in a relatively old-fashioned way because so much of what genre writers have done in the past has been based on traditional science fiction and fantasy. And a lot of science fiction and fantasy today is coming from other media as well as from types of fiction that are written more immediately, more rapidly, and there's a new style that I think people are still adapting to. Now, to give you an example, by the way, of the impact other media have had on our world and the impact that our world has had on the rest of the world, you need only look to Watchmen. Did any of you guys watch the HBO series Watchmen? See, Watchmen is an amazing example of very good storytelling and changing the world. Because while a great deal of the African diaspora was aware of what happened in Tulsa with the Great Tulsa Race Massacre, a lot of the rest of the world particularly people of my color, were not aware of it until Watchmen came along and actually revealed to us an incredibly dramatic part of our history that's also really important. So that gives you an example of how many people can watch science fiction and fantasy versus how many people necessarily read science fiction and fantasy. And thereby, my feeling is we need to adapt to their skills. We need to adapt to the skills that other media use in rapid paced storytelling, linear storytelling, in the ability to build very complex characters, to build realistic characters. And the realistic aspect of characters is also undergoing a lot of change in our society today, because today we're seeing this move toward diversity. And diversity means ethnic diversity, diversity means philosophical diversity, diversity means gender diversity. And there is so much more entering into our world these days that it gives us a whole lot of tools with which to make bigger and more realistic and more dramatic stories. So I really I recommend to all of you, embrace diversity in your storytelling. Now, where that has become an interesting conundrum is that there was a time when somebody named Clavel could write a book called Shogun, and you could have someone who was not necessarily of a specific uh, group telling the story of a group regardless of their actual lack of connection. And I feel like that's a day that has, to a degree, passed. Because if you are going to have a specific ethnicity, a specific gender, um, I think those are probably the two hot buttons, if anybody can think of any others. But if somebody is going to speak to those, to a very specific character, they need to belong to that subgroup. Now, where I think persons who aren't of those subgroups need to look is they need to look to what kind of story can they tell to tell the same story. And so you can have ensemble casts, you can have very diverse casts, just don't claim membership in a group to which you're not a member. Now, when it comes to pacing and clarity, going back to the entire film and television aspect, I think of, I tend to think of writing and the structure of writing as being camera, uh, as affecting the camera that you hold as the writer. So, for example, you are focused on your character in that point of view. But if you shift to another character, you shift the camera. If you shift to another time, you probably have a wipe that leads you to another time or another place. And that structure needs to be very clearly laid out. Also, even within your character's thought processes, if your character shifts from one thought to another, or from one aspect of a thought to a new thought, they have an epiphany, they suddenly have a realization, they suddenly shift to explain something, that is a paragraph break. So within a single point of view, you're using your paragraph breaks to carefully modulate the way your story is seen, is heard, is told. And sometimes when you have fast action, you have fast paragraph breaks. You literally can have dialogue that goes rapid fire from one character to the next, each time with a paragraph break. I always recommend that if you're going to have dialogue, use it as the opening of a paragraph. This is something that was actually held to by Lester and Judy Lynn Del Rey years ago, when they were editing the Del Rey books line. And over the years, I came to understand it in ways that I don't think they understood, because when they were editing the Del Rey books line, there were a handful of science fiction programs and films. Now, if you go look at your cable listing, or you go look at your smart TV listing, half of the things on it are science fiction, fantasy, horror, superhero, something other than normal drama. And I came to realize that what Lester and Judy Lynn were doing was they were saying, use these tools. And these tools ultimately got adopted by other media. I hope this is making sense, because it's kind of an abstract, but the fact is that if you are focused, if you watch a lot of the shows, particularly cop shows, you'll often see a focus on a character, but it will be somewhat kinetic. So sometimes that focus will shift a bit, and then it'll shift a little bit more, but it'll be still, maybe even shift to somebody else to watch their reaction to what the character is saying. But the point of view is still largely that single character. And I think that having rapid paragraph breaks, frequent paragraph breaks, makes that effect. It gives you a more kinetic style of storytelling. Now, if you shift to another character, to another place, to another time, you generally at least have to have a line break, because that line break automatically serves to tell your reader something happened. And then in that very first paragraph after that line break, they should understand what happened. They should understand, oh, wait a second, now we're in this character's point of view. Now we've moved across town to this pivotal scene. But it's still marked by a line break. When you get to a chapter break, that's for something big. And so quite often you will, I guess the best way to put it would be, the end of a chapter might be a shot rang out. End of chapter, start of a new chapter. The new chapter is either he watched the body hit the floor, or is across town and you've moved away from where the shot rang out, causing your reader a very visceral reaction. What the hell? Wait a minute, there was a shot. What are you doing? And when you get that kind of involvement by your reader, you basically have grabbed them by the scruff of the neck, because you're making them want to know what happened. So to me, that's one of the most basic things about pacing, is think in these cinematic terms. Shift your camera from one side to the other, from one person to the other, from one place to the other, from one time to the other, but always maintain a camera shift. Don't mix your point of view. Each, on either side of that line break, there's going to be a single point of view. It's going to be your protagonist's point of view, another character's point of view. It might be omniscient, although that's a tough one to do, but you want it to be a unified point of view until the other side of the line break. By the way, the line break, if anybody is wondering, in any given book, you'll suddenly find an empty line between sections. That's what I mean by a line break. Not everybody has to format a manuscript on a continuous level. Now, did you guys get the handout that I had sent that is the secrets of pacing and clarity? Somebody tell me. If somebody says no, then that tells me that we need to get it to you. Okay, now I was assured that it would be sent to you. I don't have it handy to give to you, I don't think. But Kathy, is there a way we can get handouts to each person in this panel? I think I see you there. Okay, the problem is I don't have a link. I have a document. I don't have this online. So let me see if I can do this. Because I have gathered, let me see if I can do this. Hmm. Give me just a moment, folks, and I will see to it that we get this to you. I thought it was going to be in your hands ahead of time, but I think that didn't happen. And so I'm going to need to see what I can do about getting that to you. Okay, there's your email address. And Donna is going to come to our rescue. Okay, so it is on its way to Donna, and so it will hopefully be on its way to you in a moment. But I'm going to refer to this. The main thing I wanted to say was that when you get this handout, some of them are better examples than others because they're just ones that I've gathered over the years while I've been working on, I've been working on this concept. So I want to make sure that each of you gets one at some point, and it should be on its way. Now, I'm going to tell you my two biggest pet peeves. One is I hate it when modifiers are separated from the thing they modify. There are people who will put a modifier that leaves you thinking, wait a minute, was the car blue, the sky blue, the person blue, or were they all sad? And you don't know what blue actually attached to. So if you've got a blue car, you shouldn't have a car that was parked by the side of the road blue. You should have a blue car parked by the side of the road. Ultra simple example. But I had one example here that was he squinted hard, shading his eyes against the sun with one hand. The last time I looked, the sun doesn't have a hand. So he squinted hard using one hand to shade his eyes against the sun, put the modifier right next to the thing that it needs to modify. One was the sound seemed to be coming from the horizon behind them, but he couldn't see what might be causing it in the rearview mirror. Nothing was actually causing anything in the rearview mirror. The sound seemed to be coming from the horizon behind them, but when he looked into the rearview mirror, he couldn't locate the source. Just be careful that things like against the sun, into the rearview mirror, make sure they're next to the thing where they ought to be. Make it clear. You do have the link now. And here was another one that I used that was Charmute held out her wine glass and a slave refilled it with trembling hands. I would just make it simpler. Charmute held out her wine glass and a trembling slave refilled it. Because you don't fill the glass with trembling hands. You fill the glass with wine. So things like that. The reason I say these things, the simpler you make your story in these ways, you need not remove a bit of detail. You need not remove a bit of language, but you make a book simpler to read. And thereby, you never knock your reader out of the fiction. That's your ultimate goal. Make sure that your reader is having the smoothest, most comfortable, and thereby the most immersive experience possible. Now, you can be inciting all sorts of emotions, but what you want to do is you want to make sure that nothing gets in the way of those emotions. Nothing gets in the way of those reactions. And indeed, that you are writing your story so that they're so immersed that everything that you want them to feel is felt. Now, the other thing that I think most gets me is that a writer will often feel as if they'll be writing along and they'll suddenly realize, wait a minute, I needed somebody to take a shot at the main character here, to shoot a gun, take a shot. So I'll drop them in and I'll say, suddenly a guy shot at Cherie. She recognized him as a guy that she had passed when she came into the lobby. Don't do that. When she comes into the lobby, have her see the dude. Cherie walked into the lobby. She passed a guy, noticed with amusement that he had a carnation in his lapel. That's kind of old-fashioned, she thought. She goes on, she goes up the elevator, she gets to the floor, and all of a sudden somebody's taking a shot at her, and she sees a flash of pink. Holy crap, it's the guy with the carnation. The simple fact is that by the fact that you remember with her that you saw the guy in the lobby makes it more interesting, because now, like her, you're going, what the hell? I just passed him a few minutes ago. What's going on? You're in her experience, and in her experience, you actually did see this guy earlier. So you want that linear aspect of your narrative to happen. Sometimes the guy with the pink carnation is in the lobby, and 20 chapters later, she runs into a guy, and the mastermind walked into the room. He was well dressed and wearing a pink carnation. What the hell? You've kept that whole thing for the entire story, and then you paid it off, but you still gave the reader everything that they needed to remember from the beginning of the story. And sometimes you have some dude early in the story being super rude, and you think, that guy is a real creep. I want something nasty to happen to him. So later, when you throw him into the volcano, you're like, yes, something nasty happened to him. So the more you can actually orchestrate your readers' emotions by making sure you have laid all of the groundwork. Now, I once held a copy of the typewritten manuscript for the first John Carter of Mars story that Edgar Rice Burroughs wrote. I was out at the Burroughs Ranch, and there was the typewritten manuscript kept in a safe deposit box. I was holding it. I'm looking through it, and I noticed that there are places where there's typewritten text stapled over top of earlier text. Very cool experience, but it told me that there was a point at which Burroughs read through it and thought, I don't like what's there. I need to do something better. If you have a character who appears later in the book, but you made that character appear out of the blue. If you have an event that happens out of the blue, thanks to the computer, you can go back and add into your story the foreshadowing of that event, of that character, of whatever you needed to make that the most dramatic story possible. And so use the technology that you've got. Don't wait for the editor to say, wait a minute, where the hell did this dude come from? You should make sure that when the editor gets to that dude, the editor goes, oh, that dude, cool, got it. So you're also making it easier for editors, and that's always a good and noble thing to do. I highly recommend making things easier for editors. Most editors will thank you. A few of them will continue to abuse you, but that's the nature of the animal. Let me see. What I just did there works with the next topic. I like there to be pauses particularly in dialogue, because we don't necessarily always speak in one run-on paragraph that runs 5 pages long. I know it seems like it with me, but we don't. I often will add a bit of text to indicate a small passage of time within dialogue. It can be really simple, just as simple as he said, she said. So if you want a moment where you had them take a breath, just drop in he said or she said, or they said, depending upon the gender, or however you would like to do it. I had an example here where I had a bit of dialogue that said, "Thanks, Skipper. Looks like a good crowd tonight." To add that pause between Skipper and looks, write, "Thanks, Skipper." She peered around the room. Looks like a good crowd tonight. And like I said, if you want it to be a brief one, "Thanks, Skipper." She smiled. Looks like a good crowd tonight. Add those beats. Use things like that, and use paragraph breaks, or to add a bit of a beat to keep your dialogue going a little bit better and a little bit more normally. If you hear a pause, figure out a way to put it on the page. Boy, it's been a while since I've used this. Definitely use the correct verb. Always use the verb that actually means something. So, for example, could that be magic that he's using? Phil wondered. That's not dialogue. If you had, is that magic he's using? Phil asked, is dialogue. Wondered is not asked. Mused is not asked. Smiled is not said. Do not put a comma before smiled, because smiling is not speaking. Sighing is not speaking. I'll bet it's magic. Well, I'll have to deal with it. I'll bet it's magic. Phil sighed. Well, I'll have to deal with it. Use verbs that are correct. By the way, in my perfect world, I tend to like the verb coming after the subject. So Tom said, Phyllis demanded, the girl asked, not said Tom, not demanded Phyllis. In my experience, having the verb after the person who's speaking, after the name, always works. Whereas other times it can get very awkward. And you want it to be consistent through your whole manuscript. You want to be able to, you want your book to look professional. And if you're using he said half of the time and said he half of the time, it has a more chaotic look to it. You don't want it to look chaotic. You don't want it to look sloppy. Consistency is never going to necessarily make you look worse. Consistency will only make you look better, or in the ideal world, they won't even notice it. Let me see. There are certain words that I also don't like, that if you can find a way to use something else, don't use them. using the word before, as in Hermione stood before the tribunal. That's okay in that sentence because you sort of understand it. But if Phyllis stood before the crowd, it's a little easier just to say in front of, because there are too many readers who will see before as being something else. I had a better example here. He examined the space before them. Now, that could mean he examined the space in front of them, but it could also mean that he got to it before the others. So before, at that point, can mean both where in space and where in time. Most people tend to think of before as being a thing in time. He got there before she did. They got there before the explosion occurred. So use in front of instead of before. He gestured about them. Sometimes, frankly, when I'm talking about people, I'm gesturing about them. And about generally means in reference to. So instead, he could gesture all around them instead of about. About doesn't have to mean a space. About should mean in reference to. Around should refer to the space around them. Forgive me, by the way, I haven't done this in a little while, and also, to be honest, I've never done this presentation without people responding. And I've never done this presentation without somebody saying, yeah, but dude, what about this other instance where that worked? I mean, come on, that can work. And one thing to keep in mind here is that everything I tell you can be wrong, because everything I say here can be, there can be an exception that does work. All of writing can be about exceptions. But if your exception creates a problem for the reader, and if your exception makes anything about it more difficult, less professional, or more work for the editor, then I recommend just don't do it. Don't do the things that make it harder for your reader. Spend all of your craft on making things vivid for the reader, about making things exciting for the reader. Avoid confusing them, because then the message and the emotion you're trying to get across will be confused. I have a couple of other examples here. Over should really, I've never liked something was over 15,000, because that essentially means that here's 15,000 and this is over 15,000. I consider over to be a place, and I consider more than 15,000 to be greater than 15,000. That's the way I tend to approach things, is, just be careful. Your internal dialogue may be such that you understand what you're saying. That doesn't mean your reader does. So keep that in mind. I have one other very hard and fast rule in my editing, and that is for the Oxford comma. For the Oxford comma, the answer is yes. Use the Oxford comma. Never does using the Oxford comma cause confusion. Sometimes not using the Oxford comma leaves lots of confusion. So just do. Remember the famous eats, shoots, and leaves example. If you have never heard of eats, shoots, and leaves, look it up. There's one that's becoming very difficult, and we're just going to have to deal with it. I shouldn't say difficult, it's a challenge. And that is the use of they as a personal pronoun for an individual. And the simple fact is that there are people who consider themselves to be non-binary, and they call themselves they. It's not him, it's not her, it's they. And it can be quite confusing. It's challenging to write. But it's also the right of non-binary people to be considered that way. And so it's something that we simply are going to have to deal with. It's best if there's a clear way to indicate who he is, who she is, and who they is. But for people my age, it's really difficult to figure out how to write it clearly. But I think it's important. I think, we must adapt. And so, if possible, figure out a way to not have to use it in a confusing situation. It would be particularly important in dialogue, because if a character is saying that a non-binary person did something, if the character accepts the non-binary person as non-binary, the character would then use they. And it's that simple. Now, in our world, we write about conflict, and we write about personal and social conflict too. So there could be characters who will not accept that. That should identify the character by the nature of what they do. All of your characters should mostly be addressed by their actions, not by what you tell people about them. Remember that as a sort of a very basic of writing. You should not tell your reader what a character is like. You should show the reader what the character is like. One of your characters may have opinions about another character, but you as the writer should be invisible. So if you have had to explain in the writing that this person was particularly argumentative all of the time, and most people did not like having to even talk to them, in that case, it better be one of your characters thinking or saying that, because you as the writer should not be in that position of saying that. Let me see. There are certain things that to me are a sort of a hot button that I don't like, because to my mind, these also are the writer injecting him, her, or themselves into the writing. If you say clearly something was a certain way, that's you as the writer trying to tell the reader it was clear. It would be really better to just say something was a certain way. Don't use obviously, apparently, plainly. Helena paused, clearly reining in her anger. That's the writer jumping in. It's much better to just say Helena paused, reining in her anger, particularly if it's from Helena's point of view, because Helena knows that this is what she's doing. But another character can observe that Helena is making the effort to rein in her anger. But you don't need to say clearly, obviously, apparently, or plainly. That kind of extra embellishment, to my mind, just makes it awkward, because it makes it look as if you, the writer, was trying to tell the reader something. Okay. Another thing that people say is not to mention, and I don't like that. He slalomed through the air over the giant ship, dodging other craft and falling wreckage. Not to mention the fusillades of green energy that seemingly came from every direction. Well, if you're not going to mention it, don't mention it. But you're not mentioning it. You're mentioning it. So it should simply be, he slalomed through the air over the giant ship, dodging other craft, falling wreckage, and fusillades of green energy that seemed to be coming from every direction. I just find the phrase "not to mention" to be I find it to be a difficult thing. Now, Alfred asked, does that change in the writing is from the first person point of view. I'm not sure what you're asking there, Alfred. Is that, let's see. Are you talking about when I was talking about things like clearly and obviously? Um, okay, yeah, that's a good point. In first person writing, the character can say, clearly I was wrong. Now, in dialogue, you can do almost anything, but you can still confuse your reader. In dialogue, uh, someone might say, I thought it was red, clearly I was wrong. That's okay, because that's in dialogue somebody making a point. But I think that if you're doing it not in dialogue, Phil thought it was red, clearly he was wrong, is the writer saying to the reader, this is clear. But since the writer isn't there, if it's outside of dialogue, it would be, Phil thought it was red, he was wrong. Um, I I will say that again, with first person point of view, that does tend to be a slightly different animal. I'm not personally in favor of first person. I'm not even generally in favor of present tense, although I've seen a couple of examples in recent days where present tense gave a sense of immediacy to it. But I'm not a fan of either first person or present tense, because I think that if you don't do it well, it shows more clearly. I think third person past makes more sense, because we are an outside viewer, and, and no matter what the book reads, we are outside of that book viewing. And for it to have written to appear in the book, it had to have been written in the past. So I tend to prefer third person past, but there are people who can do it well. You just got to be ready that you better be able to do it well. And if you don't have a really serious grasp of that craft, you may find it difficult to sell your book. You may find it difficult to get people to read your book. Um, on the other hand, if you're very good at it, you may have a slew of people lining up to buy your book to publish it, and a slew of people lining up in the bookstore to buy your book. So again, all rules are there to be broken, but only if you have the skill to do it. Let me see. Yeah, this is a lot of what I consider to be some of the greatest basics in 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 storytelling. Is good, modern, clear, rapid fire storytelling. Dave Gemmell, who was a very famous heroic fantasy. Um, Sorry, I got distracted by one of your messages. Dave Gemmell basically said, "Show the reader what you want, what they want, and then give it to them." And this is a skill that you can develop as a writer. If you make a character someone who they want to have persevere, you show them early in the book that this is a character they want to have persevere, and then you have them persevere. Unless you're writing an alien novel, in which case the xenomorphs kill them. I had a writer recently who actually used the exact opposite of this in Alien into Charybdis. He had the book divided into 4 parts. In each part, you came to know a specific point of view character very well, and then he killed them. And then in the next part, there's another character, perhaps someone you thought you hated, and then you find that they have a family and a daughter, and they have a code of honor, and isn't this great? And then he killed them. And in a way, he did the reverse of what Dave Gemmell said, was you show them what they want, and then you rip the carpet out from under them, which in a horror novel, in an alien novel, in a novel that has a high body count, makes the deaths more important. And I forced him to keep a couple of characters alive. He had planned to have one, but he had one character who he kept alive, and I made him keep a second one alive because he needed sort of to represent a couple of different groups within the novel to basically, and one of them who he had planned to kill helped keep the other one alive. So that was very effective. Now, I'm going to go back here for a second. Oh, I did like that one, the scouring your soul with a Brillo pad approach. That is true. In something like Alien, and frankly, in a lot of horror, you really are scouring the soul with a Brillo pad. Now, Johnny Worthen said, I want a slew. I'm not sure what you meant. You want a slew of what? And then you also said writing against expectations. Is that hard to sell? And again, I'm not entirely certain what you mean there. So if you could elaborate on those two questions, that would help a lot. Also, by the way, Alfred said, works for Joe Abercrombie. And again, there's always going to be a writer who can do things a certain way, but unless you are Joe Abercrombie, you want a slew of readers. I can dig that. Actually, that brings up an interesting point about publishing too, and that is, as publishers, we want a slew of readers as well. Any publisher is in the business to sell a slew of books. That's how they continue to stay in business and continue to bring you more books. If they don't sell a slew of books, they go out of business and you lose a marketplace. Writers want a slew of readers. And the really great thing is that a writer and a publisher tend to profit a lot off of selling a slew of books. So do the printers. So do the paper manufacturers. The only person who has only the currency of readers tends to be the editor. But I will say that as an editor, there is nothing more satisfying than seeing one of my writers reach a lot of people. And in the case of killing each people in each section of the book, that's a distinctly sadistic desire. And I recognize it completely. Now, writing against expectations and selling, fitting into genre tropes. I think you mean the expectations of the genre. And every genre has an expectation, and you're not going to lose money fulfilling those expectations if you do it successfully. The thing is that you can break all the rules you want to once you are Joe Abercrombie, once you are Brandon Sanderson, once you are Stephen King. It's proving to be a little bit more difficult for George R.R. Martin because the expectation there is for another book. And that's getting him a little bit of flack these days, I think. But the fact is that if your reader expects something of your genre, effectively fulfilling that is going to satisfy your reader and potentially a lot more readers. A satisfied reader then turns to other people and says, you've got to read this book. It's exactly the kind of thing I've been talking about. Breaking the rules, it either works or you've shot yourself in the foot. And that's why I talk about things like consistency. Keep the elements of your book consistent. Keep the Keep if you're going to use ellipses, it should be 3 periods. If you're going to use an M dash, use an actual M dash. However you do things, keep it consistent, because that's going to tell the reader that you are a professional. It's also going to help the copy editor and proofreader, both of whom are there to make sure that you are consistent. And your publisher will remember if you were acting in a professional fashion. I mean, you're going to see a lot of different things here. Simple tips: avoid repetitions. If you use the same word 5 times in a row and in short order, people are going to start to feel like, dude, pick up a thesaurus or figure out another way to phrase things. And it really does help. When I'm looking at a manuscript, I look to make sure that I haven't seen 3 paragraphs in a row start with the character's name, or 3 paragraphs in a row start with he or she, or they. But the thing is that when something is typeset, sometimes you'll scan a page and you'll pick up on repetitions like that, and they'll just look awkward. So don't do unnecessary repetitions. And watch for not only within a paragraph, but from paragraph to paragraph. I am not fond of starting a sentence, and particularly of starting a paragraph, with a conjunction. And but connect two things. They don't begin something. Now, having said that, in our language in recent years, that has become far, far, far more acceptable. So where I used to want to change every single instance, I am more sparing in my editing. But if, and there was a comma before that one, if you are going to have a conjunction and can make it a conjunction, if that previous period can become a comma, do it. Or you may find out that you didn't need to use and or but to begin with. That conjunction isn't needed because it's already implied. Alfred asked, in the manuscripts that make it to me, what percentage of them have these issues? I would say 100% of the manuscripts that get to me have some of these issues. When I look at a manuscript and find a lot of those issues, that drives me nuts, because that tells me someone has not polished their craft. And I'm really trying to employ writers who have polished their craft. Everybody has some of that. That's why they have editors, copy editors, and proofreaders. And frankly, that's the main advantage of going with a publisher versus self-publishing, is that you need backup. And so if you've got backup, these things go away. But I've never had a manuscript that didn't have some of that. And I've edited some pretty big names over different times in my career. And it's tough, because I was saying to somebody earlier today, when you guys, your greatest horror is that first page when it's blank. Because when you have that blank page, you have to put something on it, and you have to overcome every bit of self-doubt, self-concern. You've got to overcome everything and make that writing happen. And as writers, you do that. And so no matter what you do, the very fact that you have put words on the page makes it an incredible accomplishment. You guys have done amazingly well. You've done something that a huge percent of this world cannot do. How many people are there that said, I ought to write a book someday? You guys in this workshop, in this conference, you guys have done it. You guys have overcome that. and you've already won because you've made it past possibly the most insurmountable barrier. For an editor, the most horrifying thing in the world is the first page of a manuscript that I haven't read, because every manuscript is absolutely perfect until I start working on it. Then I find out what it is. And that's why I like these rules. These are all rules of thumb, but the more professional, the more polished, the more skilled, the better paced, the more fully fleshed out you can get things. I don't want to get to page 37 and go, where the hell did this guy come from? I want to remember that back in chapter 3, that's the guy who was driving the dilapidated old car, trying desperately not to be seen. Thereby, when we run into him again in chapter 37, I want to be like, that's where he went. So to me, that makes the horror of that first page far, far, far less. And when you've got an editor reading a submission, it makes it far, far, far more likely that that editor will say, I need to acquire this book. I want this book. Thank you. Okay, I think that's about all. I mean, there's lots of little details, but I think that you guys can read through this. You can get the gist of it, even if not all the examples are perfectly crafted. Someday I'm going to sit down and make this into something really perfectly crafted, but for now, whatever. Do you have any other questions? Well, you're all very welcome. And Johnny was absolutely correct. It is a small world in publishing, so be nice. Writing books I'd recommend. Honestly, I don't know of any writing books that I specifically recommend because everyone seems to fit a different need. The things I recommend are make certain you have a good dictionary at your side, a good thesaurus. Make sure you have the Chicago Manual of Style. Make sure you have the tools that you need. But I'm afraid I don't have any specific books to recommend. As a follow-up question, when you're talking about interesting characters, at what point is it too late for introductions? I think that the further you get into a book, introducing a new character all of a sudden becomes more and more awkward, just because later in the book, it looks as if you just suddenly realized you needed a character there. Now, you don't have to have introduced that character. You can have some point earlier in the book where somebody says, this dude is dangerous, and he's got a small army of Spanish mercenaries, so that when a Spanish mercenary shows up later, it's like, well, we were warned. So too late just becomes difficult. Let me see. Did that answer the question? I mean, it's really up to your story. You can always have a character suddenly appear, but if they appear too out of the blue, I think people are sort of like, oh, come on, dude, that's contrived. And you don't want them to ever say that about your characters. Alfred, did that answer the question? Good. Oh, you say very much so. Good. I'm glad. Yeah, it's all rule of thumb. You guys are the ones who have to pull it together as a finely honed weapon. And Donna, I think this is about it. I can take more questions if there are any, but otherwise, I'm just going to say, hey, and I hope that one of these days in the not too distant future, we can go to the after party in the bar. Because let me tell you, at a lot of conferences, BarCon is the best place. Okay, well, thank you guys, and enjoy the rest of your time. I'm headed out. BarCon, yes. Yep, Johnny knows. So uh, raise a pint to me tonight, wherever you are, and I'll raise a pint to you. Thanks all. Bye bye.